One of the greatest sports movies ever made is Moneyball, which is a bit odd considering the film hardly shows any actual sports being played. In fact, most of the runtime features people shuffling around in the dingy back rooms of an aging baseball stadium. You see, Moneyball is a film about analytics, a side of sports that not many fans tend to care about. Some would say that boiling down entire teams and athletes to a series of statistics removes a lot of the nuance from the game, and a lot of the magic too. But sometimes, when the stars align, numbers can tell us some of the most interesting stories that sports have to offer. Moneyball tells the story of the 2002 Oakland Athletics, who rose to the top of the majors despite having one of the lowest payrolls in the league. Using radical new analytical strategies, the A's would end up setting the longest winning streak in the history of the American League. Sometime during the midst of the streak, television cameras capture a fan holding a sign which I've always found to be absolutely fascinating. "We may never lose again." It's just such an astoundingly brazen thing to say. A notion so preposterous that we almost can't admit it's true. One that really makes us question the difference between the improbable and the impossible. This phrase carries with it an unmistakable aura. In a way, it perfectly captures the indomitable hubris of man versus the uncaring limits of nature. Because while yes, it is possible for any given team to win every game for the rest of time, such a scenario would be so astronomically unlikely that it might as well only exist in our imaginations. But hey, when the mojo starts flowing and the wins start piling up, almost anyone can be led to believe that they just can't lose. To open the 2023 baseball season, the Tampa Bay Rays got off to a remarkable start, winning each of their first 11 games. Coincidentally, I happened to be in town during the streak, so I decided to pop into the next one for a chance at witnessing something historic. After a tense game, the Rays held on to extend their streak to 12. The next day, they won again to tie the Major League record for best ever start to a season. One game after that, with a chance to stand alone in the record books, the Rays lost, ending their winning streak at 13. Of course, even this all-time great start was less than 10% of the way to the theoretical perfect MLB season, which would require winning all 162 regular season games plus 11 or so playoff games. The greatest teams in the history of the majors could only manage to win about 3 out of every 4 contests, meaning that we probably won't witness an undefeated baseball season before the heat death of the universe. In the pursuit of perfection, each individual game is another potential point of failure, meaning that leagues with smaller schedules have better odds at producing the elusive perfect season. At just over 100 games, the NBA season is considerably shorter than baseball's. The best record of any NBA team so far belongs to the 1996 Bulls, who defeated about 9 out of every 10 opponents they faced. The English Premier League features just 38 matches in a season, bringing its competitors even closer to perfection. In 2018, Manchester City went undefeated in 36 out of 38 matches. A remarkable feat, but one which reveals a complication about what we consider to be perfect. Association football features a lot of draws, an outcome many would call less than ideal. In the hunt for the truly perfect season, it's not enough to just be undefeated. The road to Perfectville must be paved through wins and wins alone. Unfortunately, the overwhelming likelihood of draws in football push any dreams of perfection hopelessly out of reach. For a team to have any realistic shot of running the gauntlet, they'd be far better off in a sport like football, where tie games are few and far between. Perhaps no other professional sport provides better odds at a perfect season than the NFL. Early iterations of the league featured just over a dozen games in a season. Teams were knocking on the door of perfection as far back as 1934, when the Chicago Bears took a 13-0 record into the championship game. Leading by 10 points heading into the fourth quarter, the Bears' historic bid would be spoiled after the New York Giants scored 27 unanswered points to steal the victory. Just 8 years later, the Bears once again took an undefeated record into the championship game before falling just short to another underdog opponent. After the 1942 season, it would take 20 years before any other NFL team got as close to perfection. The 1962 Packers finished the year with a 14-1 record, their lone loss coming from a Thanksgiving Day game versus the Detroit Lions. By now, the NFL was poised to become one of the preeminent sporting leagues in America. In 1970, they merged with the rival AFL to truly expand their influence nationwide. The merger would usher in what many consider to be the NFL's modern era, finally setting the stage for the stars of our story. By this point, most NFL franchises had decades of history under their belt. The Miami Dolphins were not one of those teams. Founded in 1966 as an expansion franchise, the Dolphins were still very much the new kids on the block at the time of the merger. As is the case with most expansion teams, they had a rough first few seasons, but things would turn around following the arrival of head coach Don Shula. Under his tenure, the Dolphins quickly rose to the top of the standings, earning their first playoff berth in 1970 and advancing all the way to the Super Bowl in 1971. While Shula's squad would fall short to the Dallas Cowboys, they would enter the following season with a vengeance. The 1972 Dolphins rocketed out of the gates with a 4-0 record, their sights set on returning to the Super Bowl. However, in just their 5th game, the young season was placed in immediate turmoil. Starting quarterback Bob Greasy suffered a broken ankle, forcing him out of action for the foreseeable future. Ordinarily, the loss of any team's most important position player would be a virtual death sentence. But thanks to Coach Shula's well-rounded roster construction, the Dolphins were able to carry on. Remarkably, the offense was able to maintain its production behind the strength of its rushing attack. Running backs Larry Zonka and Mercury Morris would finish the season as the first teammates to each rush for 1,000 yards. Coupled with the surprisingly solid play of 38-year-old backup QB Earl Morrall, the Dolphins still managed to post the league's #1 offense. Arguably more impressive, however, was the defense, which also finished as the best in the league. For Coach Shula, the strategy was simple. Keep the game close with stingy defense and eventually overwhelm the opponent with steady offensive pressure. It was far from the most flashy strategy, but in sports you don't play to be flashy, you play to win. And boy, did the Dolphins win. Following a narrow victory versus the Bills, the Dolphins were able to dispatch every other team on the schedule, entering the postseason a perfect 14-0. But despite their white-hot momentum, the team still had plenty of doubters, with some claiming that they had feasted on weak competition. Regardless, any questions over the Dolphins' greatness would be answered in the playoffs, where they would have to face the best teams the league had to offer. Their first test would come against the 10-4 Cleveland Browns. Despite forcing 5 interceptions out of the Browns' offense, the Dolphins found themselves trailing late in the 4th quarter. With their perfect season in jeopardy, the offense came in clutch, driving down the field and scoring the go-ahead touchdown. The winning play would come at the hands of an unexpected hero, third-string running back Jim Kick, who would emerge in the playoffs as the Dolphins' X-Factor. After holding off the Browns, the Dolphins had an even tougher challenge ahead of them, going on the road to face the Pittsburgh Steelers. Modern NFL fans may be confused as to how an undefeated team was not given home field advantage, but back in the early 70s, playoff hosting was actually determined by an annual rotation, providing yet another unfortunate setback for the Dolphins. Rather than basking off the temperate shores of Miami Beach, they would have to venture into the frigid north in the dead of winter, an environment notorious for punishing warm-weather teams. However, in this regard, the Dolphins caught a huge break, playing their game on an unseasonably warm day. In many ways, the 1972 AFC Championship was a meeting between two teams of destiny: the Dolphins, in pursuit of perfection, and the Steelers, fresh off of one of the most improbable victories the sport had ever seen. Within a matter of hours, one of these fairy tales would come to a tragic end. After a low-scoring first half, the Dolphins once again fell behind late in the game. With the offense in desperate need of a spark, Coach Shula made an unexpected decision. Quarterback Earl Morrall was taken out of the game to make way for the return of Bob Greasy. The changeup disrupted the Steelers' defensive game plan, leading to 2 quick Miami touchdowns, giving the Dolphins enough of a cushion to hold on for the rest of the game. And with that, the perfect season was just 1 win away. Awaiting the Dolphins in the Super Bowl were the Washington Redskins, who had just finished manhandling the defending champion Dallas Cowboys. Although the Dolphins had overcome every opponent thus far, many were still skeptical that they could seal the deal, with some sportsbooks ranking Washington as the odds-on favorites. It's understandable why so many fans were hesitant to embrace what was happening. Betting on the Dolphins would have been betting on the unprecedented. Thus far in their brief history, the franchise had hardly done anything worth remembering. Most people around the country barely knew of their existence. But soon enough, that would all change. Because on that sunny January afternoon, the 1972 Dolphins would accomplish something unforgettable. Welcome to Perfectville, population 1. In just their 7th year as a franchise, the Miami Dolphins achieved the most coveted feat in the 50-year history of the league, a final record of 17 wins, 0 ties, and 0 losses, the mythical win percentage of 1,000. From this point on, the NFL would never be the same. The Dolphins had proven that the perfect season was possible, and in capturing the Holy Grail, their role had suddenly shifted from pursuers to protectors. Now that one team had finally broken through to perfection, the entire sport was left to wonder who was going to get there next. And so, the hunt was on. 32 teams, one destination. From that point forward, they were all chasing the 72 Dolphins. It's somewhat fitting that the NFL's first perfect season happened to coincide with the rise of Led Zeppelin's hit song Stairway to Heaven. Throughout 1972, the track had begun to dominate radio stations across the nation, providing a rather serendipitous soundtrack to the Dolphins' ascension into the history books. Stairway to Heaven was indeed an accurate description of the monumental task awaiting the rest of the league. From the start of the season, each win can be seen as another step closer to the promised land. The stairway is treacherous and unforgiving, with just one slip-up erasing all of your progress and sending you back to square one. Every team starts off the year undefeated, but after week 1, at least half will be out of contention. By week 2, only about a quarter remain alive. In a typical season, there's usually only one undefeated team left by around week 5, less than halfway through the schedule. Football is very much governed by chance, with random factors such as weather and injuries providing substantial variance over long periods of time. On any given Sunday, it's not uncommon for even the most dominant teams to suffer the occasional fluke loss. Needless to say, replicating the perfect season would be no easy feat. For the rest of the 70s, few other teams even got close. The 1975 Vikings got off to the best start at 10-0. The best overall season belonged to John Madden's Raiders, who lost just once during their 1976 championship run. 2 years later, the NFL expanded their regular season from 14 to 16 games, pushing the perfect season just a bit further out of reach. While future attempts at perfection would be more difficult, succeeding would be even more impressive. The next perfect season would not just equal the 72 Dolphins, but surpass them with a theoretical record of 19-0. After the schedule change, it took a while before another great run at perfection. The next team to truly challenge the Dolphins was, funnily enough, the Dolphins. But this iteration of the roster was quite different than the one from 1972. Rather than controlling games through their bruising defense and rushing attack, these new-look Dolphins found their success through the air. Because in 1984, the Dolphins didn't just have a good passing season, they didn't even have a great one. They had the best statistical passing season since the invention of the forward pass, and it was all made possible by a 23-year-old from Pittsburgh named Dan Marino.
We are seeing another spectacular effort by Marino, who fires. Touchdown!
Marino gunning deep, and Clayton is open for a touchdown!
What a bazooka shot by Marino. One of the more incredible passes I have ever seen.
Marino throws deep downfield. It is caught by Fryer.
Yes!
Touchdown! Touchdown Dolphins!
In the entire history of the quarterback position, you can make the argument that Dan Marino was the most physically gifted passer the sport has ever seen. In the modern-day game, players like Aaron Rodgers and Patrick Mahomes have provided quite the spectacle over their elite combination of arm strength and accuracy. Dan Marino's 1984 season represents what would happen if one of these guys hopped in a time machine and traveled 35 years into the past. Indeed, Marino resembled a quarterback of the distant future, with throwing mechanics so quick that television cameras could hardly keep up with them. In just his sophomore season, he would rewrite the record books for the position. Prior to 1984, the NFL season record for touchdown passes stood at 36. By season's end, Marino had pushed the record to 48. This was no incremental improvement. This was like the scene in 2001: A Space Odyssey that cuts from a bone to a spaceship. The numbers set during Marino's quantum leap would not be bested until long after he retired, and the players that eventually surpassed him did so under a rule set that more heavily favored offensive production. Adjusted for era, Marino's 1984 season has to go down as the most impressive in history. Naturally, it contributed to a lot of wins as well. The '84 Dolphins would be the first team since the '72 squad to reach the 11-0 mark. Unfortunately, their perfect season would come to an end just 1 week later after an overtime loss to the Chargers. They would finish the regular season with a 14-2 record, one win back of the San Francisco 49ers, who posted the NFL's first 15-1 season. The two teams would end up meeting in the Super Bowl, where San Francisco's superior defense kept Marino's arm in check. The 49ers handed the Dolphins a crushing defeat, and adding insult to injury, surpassed the win total of the '72 team. Although the Niners fell just short of the perfect 19-0, they had proven that it was a lot closer than what many may have thought. Despite the sour end of the season, the future looked bright in Miami. Behind their veteran coach and transcendent young quarterback, it seemed like the sky was the limit. But this is the point where our story takes a turn for the strange. While Dolphin fans were looking into the future, they should have taken more time to savor the present. Because as of today, 1984 would mark the last season Shula, Marino, or the Dolphins franchise would ever reach the Super Bowl. 1984 would also mark the retirement of Bob Kuechenberg, the last active member of the 1972 roster. And with that, the NFL's first perfect team had entirely exited the sport, or so we thought. Looking back now, many are convinced that the '72 Dolphins never fully left. Over the years, a mysterious pattern has developed involving teams who get a little too close to perfection, one that began immediately after the 1984 season. After already surviving one threat to their legacy, the Dolphins would have to contend with an even greater one in 1985, a franchise that was no stranger to chasing perfection. 50 years after their original undefeated run, the Chicago Bears had returned to finish the job. By December, they had shot out to a 12-0 record, anchored by the most feared defensive unit in NFL history. By this point, the Bears looked downright unstoppable, defeating their last three opponents by a combined score of 104-3. If any team was meant to finish the year with a perfect record, this was surely the one. But before they could do so, they would have to pay a visit to Miami to face the Dolphins on Monday Night Football. For the first time, the Dolphins had the opportunity to defend their own legacy, and with the prestige of the '72 team on the line, they went out and played ball.
Marino, Matt Moore. Moore takes it in. Touchdown. Marino. Cooper. Davenport. Into the end zone easily. Marino gets the pressure, but he gets it to Matt Moore. Hysteria here in the Orange Bowl.
Against their last six opponents, the Bears' defense had only allowed a total of 29 points. On this night, the Dolphins had scored more than that by halftime. All season long, the Bears had snuffed out pretty much every quarterback they faced, but they had yet to face a quarterback like Marino. The 46 defense relied on collapsing the line of scrimmage before the offense even had a chance to throw, but Marino had such a quick release that he could consistently beat out the pressure. Despite how overpowered the scheme had been for the rest of the season, it had one critical weakness in its pass coverage, a weakness that Shula and Marino exposed in front of the largest televised audience in Monday Night Football history. But by far the most influential audience of the night was the one live in attendance at the Orange Bowl, the venue responsible for much of the Dolphins' early success. Back in the day, it was well known as one of the loudest stadiums in the sport due to how close the bleachers were to the field. In football lore, there's a term known as the 12th man, describing how a unified sea of fans can be just as powerful as an extra man on the field. On that night, the Dolphins faithful delivered what truly was their finest hour. During one sequence in the third quarter, they are going absolutely ballistic. The stadium is so deafening that the Bears offense can't even hear their own snap count.
The partisan crowd, noisy to the point that the Bears cannot hear their offensive signals.
For a long time, the Dolphins were the only professional sports team in the entire state. 8 days a year, the Orange Bowl transformed from an ordinary ballpark to the pantheon of the Florida man. It goes without saying that strange things tend to happen here. No matter how good the Bears were, they never really stood a chance. It just wasn't their night. It's a good thing the Dolphins stopped them when they did, because after this game, the Bears steamrolled everyone else for the rest of the season, winning the championship with a record of 18-1. While many fans were eager to see the two teams square off once more in the Super Bowl, the Dolphins never made it. The highly anticipated rematch would be thwarted by the New England Patriots, a team that will come up again later on in our story. After the '85 season, the quest for perfection died down for the rest of the decade. The 1990 season featured a unique scenario in which two teams reached the 10-0 mark. However, as if their fates were intertwined, both ended up losing the following week. After an 11-0 start by Washington the next season, the hunt died down again for many more years. Oddly enough, the Dolphins spent a couple more seasons as the last undefeated team, which was a testament to their winning culture at the time. However, after the 1995 season, the organization would experience its biggest shakeup yet, when Don Shula finally called it quits. He retired as the winningest coach in NFL history. By this point, Shula basically was the Dolphins. He had been there for every milestone the franchise had accomplished, and his departure finally severed the link between the team's past and present. 1997 marked 25 years since the perfect season. Maybe it was finally time to let it go. The following year, it would once again be put to the test. The 1998 season was dominated by two juggernauts, starting with the defending champion Denver Broncos, who became the first team in a quarter century to reach 13-0. With just 3 games left in the regular season, the Broncos entered their next contest as 2 touchdown favorites versus the mediocre New York Giants. However, the Broncos' offense sputtered all day, and with less than a minute left, the Giants scored the game-winning touchdown to end Denver's bid at perfection. In the NFL, there's no such thing as a guaranteed win. Even the bottom feeders of the league must not be underestimated. The perfect season requires near-flawless execution each and every week. Any complacency can be punished from the most unlikely of sources. It turns out the Broncos were not done being punished. After losing their perfect record, they had to travel to Miami to face Dan Marino on Monday Night Football. As was the case with the '85 Bears, the Dolphins handed the NFL's strongest team their worst loss of the season. Just 6 weeks later, the Broncos would return to the very same stadium and capture their second consecutive Super Bowl. It was almost like their loss to the Dolphins was some rite of passage, as if relinquishing part of their record helped appease the spirits of football past, granting them a safe voyage through the postseason. Denver's second loss left them with the second-best record in the league, behind the 15-1 Minnesota Vikings, a team that got closer than any other to the first 16-0 regular season. A 3-point loss in Week 9 was the only thing keeping them out of the record books. Remarkably, the '98 Vikings were flirting with perfection in more ways than one. Their kicker, Gary Anderson, had not missed a field goal all year. Thus far in the entire history of the league, no kicker had ever achieved a perfectly accurate season. Thanks to Anderson's automatic leg, the Vikings looked to be on a collision course with the Broncos. However, when the team needed him most, with a trip to the Super Bowl on the line, he missed. The Vikings never made it to Miami. Some would say they had a little too much perfection to handle. The Dolphins' record had survived yet again, and as the millennium came to a close, so too did the career of Dan Marino. He retired as the all-time leader in pretty much every passing stat imaginable, but despite all he accomplished, he was nonetheless haunted by his own imperfection. After all those years, the Dolphins front office could never surround Marino with a good enough supporting cast to compete for a championship. He walked away from the game as arguably the best player to never win a Super Bowl ring. It's fascinating to think that by the end of the 90s, the Dolphins franchise had showcased possibly the best coach and best quarterback in the history of the league, yet both were seemingly overshadowed by this increasingly distant record. The longer it stood, the more the legend around it grew. Around this time, a rumor began circulating that after every season's last unbeaten team loses its perfect record, the surviving members of the 72 Dolphins celebrate by toasting champagne. Their presence still loomed over the league like some sort of defiant specter. It was like the game had progressed to the future, but this relic from the past would not allow itself to be left behind. As the years went on, the league-wide failure to replicate the perfect season only made teams want it more, and it wasn't long before the Dolphins' record was under siege once again. The 2000s would bring plenty of more challengers to the throne, starting with the 04 Steelers, who became just the fourth team to post a 15-1 regular season. Rookie quarterback Ben Roethlisberger led them on a 14-game winning streak to end the year. However, much like the '98 Vikings, the Steelers would fall short in the playoffs, suffering a convincing defeat to the Patriots. Despite Roethlisberger's impressive rookie campaign, much of the headlines throughout the season would be dominated by another quarterback. 2004 was a breakout season for Peyton Manning, who became the first player to surpass Dan Marino's single-season touchdown record. The year after, he had his sights set on another record. The 2005 Colts looked like the team to beat all season long. Their high-powered passing attack carried them all the way to a 13-0 record. But just like the '98 Broncos, Manning and the Colts would lose their next two games, finishing the regular season at 14-2. However, unlike the Broncos, the Colts would not be blessed with playoff success. Despite being overwhelming championship favorites, their season would end in disastrous fashion. Down by just 3 points in the final seconds, the Colts needed to make a 46-yard field goal to tie the game. Lining up for the attempt was Mike Vanderjagt, who by this point was the most accurate kicker in NFL history. Thus far in his playoff career, he hasn't missed a kick on the Colts' home turf. In any other circumstance, things would have probably turned out differently. But these Colts had challenged perfection, and the Ghosts had unfinished business.
And it's no good! He missed it. Not even close, wide right.
Despite the brutal defeat, Manning and the Colts hadn't given up on chasing perfection. In 2006, they got off to a far more modest 9-0 start before losing 4 of their last 7 games. Oddly enough, the added adversity seemed to work in their favor, as this Colts team marched through the playoffs to score the city of Indianapolis their first Super Bowl victory. The championship seemed to corroborate a paradoxical trend among the NFL's contenders. For the past few years, teams with worse records were having better success in the playoffs. It was almost as if to give yourself better odds at winning the title, it was advantageous to lose more during the regular season. This idea would be revisited by the 2009 Colts, who found themselves with a third opportunity at a perfect season, and to raise the stakes even higher. This time, they had company. 2009 was just the second season in recent history that saw 2 teams reach the 10-0 mark. The New Orleans Saints had joined the Colts in the pursuit of perfection, and both teams just kept on winning. Their records climbed to 11, 12, then 13-0 before the Saints finally conceded a defeat. Once again, the Colts stood unopposed as the last remaining perfect team. The following week, they looked poised to advance to 15-0 while leading the Jets late in the third quarter. It was then when coach Jim Caldwell did the unthinkable.
Peyton Manning has his helmet on. For the first time all season, someone other than Peyton Manning will take the snap at quarterback for the Indianapolis Colts. The Painter is the number 2 quarterback. Lost the football. It's loose inside the 5-yard line. The Jets cover for the touchdown.
After already securing home field advantage in the playoffs, the Colts decided to bench their starters for the remainder of the game. For the first and only time in league history, a team had intentionally sabotaged its own perfect season. The decision would prove highly controversial. The moment Peyton Manning was taken out of the game, the fans in attendance rained down thunderous boos. Many of them couldn't believe what they were watching. The Colts had rested their starters before, but never with a perfect season on the line. The coaching staff remained steadfast in their reasoning, saying that winning the championship was the ultimate goal, and that preserving the health of their star players was imperative to that goal, even if it meant sacrificing a perfect record. At the end of the day, an undefeated season is theoretically insignificant. It doesn't offer any additional rewards or advantages versus any other champion. The objective of NFL football is to hoist the Lombardi Trophy at the end of the season, and however you manage to get there should be irrelevant. The perfect season is just bragging rights. It's a nice thing to have, an amusing little factoid for geeks on the internet to romanticize in the unknowable future. But beyond all that, does it really, truly matter? Well, to answer that question, you have to look no further than the expressions of the fans and players watching their run come to a bitter end. You can say what you want to justify what happened, but it clearly mattered to them. 6 weeks later, the Colts would lose the Super Bowl, and their undefeated season was sacrificed for nothing. They were beaten by the Saints, who had surrendered their perfect record fair and square. Their season came to an end in Miami, meaning that the Ghosts may have played a hand in it. Perhaps they didn't want to leave the Colts with any excuses, to entertain the thought that they could have been perfect if they had simply chosen to. If a team was truly meant to be perfect, the results would be unmistakable. We cannot choose perfection any more than we can choose our destiny. And so, the Dolphins' perfect season had survived its most competitive decade yet. Despite facing more challengers than ever, no other team could manage to top them. The next 10 years would see the pursuit of perfection slow down considerably, but they still produced a few worthy adversaries, the first of which were the 2011 Packers, who started the year 13-0 before being upset by the 5-8 Chiefs. After the loss, the Packers followed in the footsteps of the Colts by resting their starters, a decision that once again backfired. After dominating all year with their historically great offense, the Packers' stars ran cold in the postseason. They earned the dubious distinction of becoming the first 15-1 team that failed to win a single playoff game. The 2015 season featured what remains to this day as the last great run at perfection. The Carolina Panthers got off to the rare 14-0 start before inexplicably falling to the Atlanta Falcons, a team they had beaten 38-0 just 2 weeks earlier. The Panthers would go on to the Super Bowl, where they would lose to our old friend Peyton Manning. Although he never got his perfect season, he was able to retire on top. As for the Panthers, they only continued the futility of 15-1 teams in the postseason. As of today, they are the last NFL roster to finish the regular season with just one loss. Since then, no one else has really come close to the perfect season, and the legacy of the 72 Dolphins lives on. However, many of you watching have probably noticed that I haven't told the full story, and that's because I've been saving the best for last. Over all this time, many teams have tried and failed to replicate the perfect season, but there is one that got closer than any other.
The market's in an itsy-bitsy little gully right now. It's like everybody said, okay, that was crazy, let's just all calm down.
By the mid-2000s, the Dolphins had fallen on hard times. For the past several years, South Florida had been battered by hurricanes, which only served to punctuate the gloomy outlook for the future of the organization. Ever since Marino and Shula retired, the Dolphins had struggled to find any quarterback or coach that had the makings of a worthy successor. Meanwhile, the franchise that had was their longtime divisional foes, the New England Patriots. As the Dolphins sunk into dysfunction and instability, the Patriots had assembled the most ferocious dynasty the league had ever known. This team was no ordinary juggernaut. It was far more diabolical than that. Facing the Patriots during this time was like staring down the Death Star. They were a team designed to crush the hopes and dreams of the rest of the league. And for Dolphins fans, no season felt more hopeless than 2007. In August of that year, the city of Miami began the process of demolishing the Orange Bowl. The Dolphins had relocated to a new stadium long ago, and the site had fallen into disrepair. Ever since the departure, the team was never really the same. It seemed like the franchise had left part of their heart and soul in that old venue. The Orange Bowl was still very much the spiritual center of the Miami Dolphins, especially the 1972 team. By erasing such a historic place, it's almost like they were asking for trouble.
Applying the last lick from the Patriots. Our final score, 49-28, New England.
Immediately after, the Dolphins got off to the most miserable start in franchise history. By the halfway point in the season, they had failed to win a single game. Their three best offensive players had suffered season-ending injuries, leaving their game plan in a disarray. The Dolphins had no other choice but to conduct their offense through quarterback Cleo Lemon, a player who never started another meaningful game before or since. To make matters even worse, their arch rivals were headed in the polar opposite direction. The 2007 Patriots were on track to become the greatest team in history, featuring the most disgustingly unfair amassment of talent that will likely ever exist on an NFL roster. At the center of it all was newcomer Randy Moss, a top 5 receiver of all time, teaming up with franchise cornerstone Tom Brady, the single greatest quarterback of all time. They didn't just start the year undefeated. No one even came close to defeating them. Plenty of other teams through the years have challenged perfection, but these Patriots were different. It wasn't enough to simply win. They had to do so with such extreme prejudice. Before long, it was clear that this team had only one destination in mind. A championship wasn't enough. They were aiming for something even greater. By December, the Patriots still hadn't lost, and the Dolphins still hadn't won. The sky was falling in Miami, and the ghosts were nowhere to be seen. For the Dolphins faithful, the grim reality was starting to set in. Not only were the Patriots closing in on the ultimate triumph, but the Dolphins were on the verge of the ultimate humiliation. Since the advent of the 16-game schedule, no NFL team had ever gone winless. In a cruel twist of fate, the franchise renowned for the NFL's most prestigious achievement was now in danger of inheriting its most shameful. 0-16, the mark of the banished prince, a scar from which they could never recover. With just 3 games left to play, it was starting to look like destiny. At that point, they had precisely one opportunity to save themselves. Their next matchup came against the struggling Baltimore Ravens, by far the most winnable game remaining on the schedule. If the Dolphins can't pull out a victory here, they're not going to have another chance. After 2 quarters of offensive ineptitude, they enter the half trailing 13-3. In attendance for the halftime ceremony are the members of the 1972 team, who are being honored for the 35-year anniversary of their grand accomplishment. Their presence signals one of 2 things. Either the Dolphins have found their salvation, or this really is the end, and the ghosts are just here to say goodbye to the legacy they built all those years ago. Perhaps sensing the gravity of the situation, Miami's players emerged from the locker room with purpose. As the pride of the franchise rested on their shoulders, the Dolphins rallied back to tie the game, and eventually take the lead. All they had to do now was hold off the Ravens for 2 minutes. However, after a bad kickoff, Baltimore drove all the way down the field. In the final seconds, they get the ball just 1 foot away from the end zone, but rather than trying for the go-ahead touchdown, the Ravens elect to play it safe and kick a field goal, sending the game to overtime. Luck is not on the Dolphins' side as the Ravens get the ball first, forcing Miami's exhausted defense back on the field. Baltimore marches all the way into scoring position, where they can end the game with a 44-yard field goal. This season, the Dolphins have lost 6 games by just a 3-point margin, and it's about to happen again. A series of individual bad breaks have now snowballed into the nightmare they currently inhabit. The stadium has fallen mostly silent. Deep down, everyone is expecting this kick to go in, including Dolphins color commentator Jim Mandich. He was there during the franchise's finest hour, and now he's arrived at its darkest. It's been a long season, and he's preparing to sink into the abyss. What happens next, though, springs him back to life.
Up is the holder. The pick is up. He's
Done! And he missed it! Unbelievable! Man, he missed it!
And just like that, the Dolphins have a chance. If the offense can just find any sort of magic, they can still come out of this thing in one piece. However, for a unit that has struggled mightily all season, the end zone feels so very far away. 35 years ago, the Dolphins were on their way to being immortalized in the record books. Now, these Dolphins are fighting for the right to be forgotten. Way back at the end of Super Bowl VII, embedded within their crowning achievement was another embarrassing episode that has been mostly lost to time. At the end of the game, kicker Garo Yepremian committed one of the most atrocious bloopers in the history of organized sports. It's fascinating to consider that the NFL's perfect team was somehow responsible for its single worst play. Maybe it was their gift to the universe to prove the age-old wisdom that no one is truly perfect. 35 years later, the universe would repay the favor, as for a single moment, the NFL's worst team was blessed with the perfect play.
Camarillo comes in motion to the near side of the formation. Lemon back to throw. Got time over the middle.
Camarillo's got it! 40!
He might
30! He may go the distance!
going in!
The Bobby Dolphins have won the football game! Unbelievable! Unbelievable!
The Dolphins have done it! They have won this football game! Take us out of the history book! We're not going in for that one, baby!
The 07 Dolphins may have narrowly avoided catastrophe, but they weren't out of the woods yet. While they were spared from going down as the worst ever, their legacy was still very much in jeopardy. The following week, the 1-13 Dolphins traveled to Foxborough to face the 14-0 Patriots. They enter the game as 22-point underdogs, one of the biggest point spreads in history. However, the Dolphins have overcome the odds before when it came to defending their honor. Could the worst version of the Dolphins really pull off the upset versus the best version of the Patriots? Well, as amusing as that may have been, even I have to admit that the idea was a little too far-fetched. And so, the Patriots were just one game away from the first undefeated regular season in the 16-game era. The only team left standing in their way was the 10-5 New York Giants. By this point, both teams had locked up their respective playoff spots, meaning that they each had the opportunity to rest their starters. However, understanding what was at stake, everyone showed up to play. For a moment, it looked like the Patriots had found their kryptonite as the Giants entered the fourth quarter with the lead. But Brady and Moss could not be stopped as the Patriots rallied back to win. They had arrived at the elusive 16-0, just 3 postseason victories away from perfection. Dolphins fans and the rest of the league held their breath as the Patriots inched closer and closer. The Jaguars put up a valiant effort but were ultimately no match. The fabled 17-0 record, which stood alone for so long, had been equaled. In the AFC Championship, the Chargers held the Pats' offense to just 21 points, but it still wasn't enough to stop them. For the first time in NFL history, a team had reached 18-0. The 72 Dolphins had been surpassed. This Patriots team may have held nearly every single accolade the league kept track of, but they still weren't perfect. Awaiting them in Super Bowl 42 was their final opponent. In a twist no one saw coming, the only team left standing in their way was, once again, the New York Giants. It would be the first Super Bowl appearance for the other Manning brother. While Peyton could never quite find perfection, Eli could do the next best thing by preventing it. The Giants entered the game as one of the biggest underdogs in Super Bowl history. Nobody expected them to get there in the first place, and now that they did, they had to face what was already being crowned as the best team ever. But despite the overwhelming task in front of these Giants, they knew that the pressure was on the Patriots. After how far they'd come, this was a game they could not lose. Sometimes it pays to be the underdog. You have nothing to do but go out and shock the world. The game was a tense defensive struggle. For the first 3 quarters, the score remained deadlocked at 7-3. With just 10 minutes left, the Giants finally broke through to take the lead. It looked like the nerves were really getting to the Patriots, as they were on the verge of losing everything they had worked for. With their backs against the wall, Brady led a touchdown drive to retake the lead with less than 3 minutes to play. If the defense could stop the Giants from marching 83 yards down the field, then perfection was theirs. Thus far, the Patriots have experienced good fortune all season, but their luck was about to change, because after biding their time until the last possible opportunity, the ghosts had finally come out to play. Early in the drive, the Patriots have a chance to end the game by stopping the Giants on 4th and 1. Running back Brandon Jacobs just barely converts, and the game continues. On the next play, Manning gets hammered by a defender, but he hangs on to the ball, and the game continues. The play after that, Manning misses badly on a throw, sending the ball straight towards defender Asante Samuel. The ball bounces off his fingertips, and the game continues. The Giants had now dodged a bullet on 3 consecutive plays, but it's the next one which turns this sequence from lucky to downright supernatural. Manning drops back to throw and is immediately smothered by the defense. Somehow he escapes. Eli heaves the ball towards receiver David Tyree, who after this game will never catch another pass for the rest of his career.
Catch is made down at the 25. What a play. David Tyree.
Tyree had Harrison all over him. The ball was on his helmet, but he got his other hand on it and pulled it in.
What just transpired may have been the most unlikely series of events to ever happen in a single NFL play, and it occurred at the direct expense of a team 60 seconds away from a perfect season. In this moment, it finally dawned on the Patriots that after all this time, they weren't the team of destiny. 4 plays later, the Giants scored the game-winning touchdown. Many considered a Giants victory to be unthinkable, but if you've been following along, you may have noticed that they've been doing this kind of thing since the very beginning. The final seconds of the game featured Tom Brady desperately chucking the ball downfield to Randy Moss, a play that had worked so many times for them during the season. This time, however, it just isn't meant to be. The Patriots had made it to the very doorstep of Perfectville. They kept knocking and knocking, but no one was there to answer. The 2007 Patriots finished with an 18-1 record, choking away perfection in the final minute of the final game. They had come the closest of anybody and were therefore condemned to the very worst fate. Many years later, Tom Brady retired as by far the greatest quarterback to ever play the game. He ended up throwing for over 100,000 yards, an unfathomable amount. He played the most, did the most, and won the most. He was the absolute best athlete that anyone could have asked for. But he wasn't perfect. Since 1972, no one is. In the summer of 2013, the undefeated Dolphins received an unexpected invitation. President Obama had welcomed them to the White House. Ordinarily, this honor is reserved for reigning champions of American sports, but by this point, the squad had become so legendary that it was worth the exception. In their time, the NFL just didn't matter as much as it does today, and the team never received a proper ovation. This was possibly because then President Richard Nixon, a Redskins fan, evidently didn't feel like celebrating. Despite the snub, the players never thought much of it. What's funny to consider is that the 72 Dolphins probably never realized just how big of a deal their accomplishment would end up being. It's fair to say that no other team in American sports has remained so relevant for so long. 2022 marked 50 years since the perfect season. By now, the NFL's 16-game era has come and gone, with no team ever reaching the elusive 19-0. As of today, the bar to clear is now 20-0, after the league expanded its regular season to 17 games in 2021. And with talks of an 18-game schedule on the horizon, it's looking more and more improbable that anyone else can get to Perfectville. And so, the obvious question remains, will anyone ever break the Dolphins' record? However, I think the far more interesting question to be asked is whether we want to see it happen. When it aired, more viewers tuned into Super Bowl 42 than any other game in American history. People are fascinated by perfection. To witness it is akin to encountering a pristine oasis in a vast, barren wasteland. The human condition is defined by imperfection. Modern existence is utterly inundated with mediocrity and dysfunction, and while you may think this would only intensify our appetite for perfect things, it turns out that people seem to prefer the contrary, because as the Patriots were closing in on 19-0, most of us were rooting for them to lose. The same is true whenever any team gets a little too far in the season without a defeat. In fact, preying on the downfall of the last undefeated team has become somewhat of an annual tradition. The NFL has already seen one perfect record, and for most fans, that's enough. It's been around for so long now that it's hard to imagine the game without it. So many illustrious teams have failed in their quest to reproduce it that any others pursuing it today just feel unworthy. But surely, after enough time passes, a new challenger is bound to come along and give the Ghosts a run for their money. So far this season, the 2023 Dolphins won't finish the year perfect, but they did manage to make some history of their own. The ultra-rare 70-point game, a milestone that no team had accomplished since the dark ages of the sport, a feat so alien to the modern football world that it doesn't look right on our present-day scoreboards. After all this time, the Dolphins still have the uncanny ability to captivate us by making numbers go up. At the end of the game, they had the opportunity to run up the score even higher and tie the all-time record of 73. However, while on the cusp of what could have been his most defining career achievement, Coach Mike McDaniel ordered his team to stand down. When asked about it afterwards, he explained that it was a matter of karma. The modern NFL is more data-driven than ever before. Every measurable statistic is tracked and analyzed to give teams any sort of edge over the competition. McDaniel himself is considered one of the most brilliant strategic minds in the game, and yet, plenty of the league's most important historic decisions are still governed by superstition.
And that's called karma. And I'm trying to keep good karma with the Miami Dolphins.
By now, everyone knows that bad things happen when you try to pass 72.
Hi, I'm Don Shula. I like to watch movies. I've seen this next one quite a few times already. But you know something? I don't think I'll ever get tired of seeing it.
They say that records are meant to be broken. It stands to reason that somewhere down the line, one fortunate team will eventually join the perfect Dolphins on the mountaintop. However, there is a realistic possibility that no one ever gets there again, and that the perfect season is that much more special than anyone could have imagined. If that's the case, then the 72 Dolphins may have stumbled upon something that defies everything we know about sports. They own a title that they may truly never lose again. The legend continues, and until anyone else can complete the journey up the stairway, the NFL's only perfect team will be waiting and watching. As the years go by, these select few men have nothing else to do but savor the moment. Many of them are no longer with us. It's entirely possible that their defining achievement will outlive them all. If there really is a team of ghosts haunting the league from the other side, it's just gonna keep getting stronger. Someday, not too long from now, they'll all be reunited for the final time. And when that happens, I hope they remember to bring champagne.
Miami has the Dolphins, the greatest football team. We take the ball from goal to goal like no one's ever seen. We're in the air, we're on the ground, we're always in control. And when you say Miami, you're talking Super Bowl, 'cause we're the Miami Dolphins.